Hello, everybody. I wanted to take about 20 minutes and share some insights into what I've been doing with API design and documentation when it comes to using AI assistants. And those of you that have been following me for a while may be familiar with the process that I have created called ADDR. So I want to talk about how it's changed because of Gen AI, and from there being able to leverage that to improve our documentation and our design processes. So just a brief introduction. So I'm the founder of Launch Any. It's a boutique consulting company. I focus on API training as well as consulting. Been doing that for over a decade, just focused purely on APIs, and nearly 2.5 decades otherwise. I wrote a book called Principles of Web API Design back at the end of 2021, and that captured a lot of the insights and details that I had from delivering training live and coaching teams, either in individuals or large scale teams of in organizations that have 10,000, 15,000 developers, how to do that at scale so that we can deliver great APIs to everyone. The ADDR process, just for a brief introduction for those that aren't familiar, it stands for Align, Define, Design, and Refine. I outline that whole thing in the book. And the idea here is that what we want to do is design and document our APIs effectively. And to do that, we need to understand what people are trying to do with our APIs. And what I used to do is I used to teach how to design APIs by just modeling. We would dive kind of into a wireframe mode. We'd wireframe what the API would look like, when then we would just start figuring out all of our puts and gets and response codes and everything else. And what I found was the line phase is actually the most critical. And because of that, what we really have is a situation where a line phase becomes a central and critical effort that helps everything else fall into place. And when we bring in Gen AI, this just becomes even more apparent. So the idea here is that in the align phase, what we want to do is encourage communication. We want to make sure that we understand what the goals of the API or APIs are going to be, how they align with our business architecture, our business goals, the outcomes of our users, and ultimately the APIs we're going to build. And then we define an API profile, kind of a wireframe sketch of what the API is going to do based on the insights we gain from the align phase. And whenever you're doing an API design, or if you're writing documentation, whatever it might be that you're involved with, if we don't know where we're going and what those outcomes are that we've identified in the align phase, it's very, very difficult to figure out how we're going to get where we need to go. Were we successful? Do we deliver the documentation that is effective for using the APIs other than just standard reference documentation? And then once we have sketched out what the API is going to do, what resources it's going to have, what operations and so on, then we can design it, we can apply our design style guide, and then we can get feedback. And oftentimes what we'll do is we'll spend a lot of time in the align phase to make sure that we understand what's needed from a business perspective, what's needed from the end user perspective, and how that API is going to deliver on that. And then we'll spend a lot of time in the refine phase. We'll be creating mocks and example walkthroughs and example workflows and getting started guides and things like that that will help flesh out the API design, help us catch anything that could be an issue before we go into production and becomes much more expensive cost of change factor. So with that, what I want to do is talk a little bit about how I'm using Gen AI and coaching teams on Gen AI with the ADDR process and how it's shifting things around quite a bit. And I think there's going to be really a really nice way for technical writers to find ways to incorporate a repeatable, scalable methodology like ADDR into your processes, whether you'd use it just for API design, if you use it for documentation, or the full life cycle. But it'll also show how you can actually gain a lot of insight and drive a lot of documentation efforts by being involved early on in the design processes. And in the align phase, typically what we do is we do two things. We want to take a jobs to be done approach to understand the problem or situation at hand, the job that needs to be done, and the desired outcome when the job is complete. And so we do that, and we use typically things called job stories, which are similar to user stories, but they focus on those three elements. So if you're writing user stories and they have these three elements, you're all set. I tend to use job stories because the format's just a little bit better. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. And then once we get all the job stories figured out, we'll break them down into the steps. And that usually requires us to think a little bit more about what it is we're trying to do, and if there's specific workflow steps, things like that that we have to consider in our API design. So I'll use a variety of different prompts. When we would first uh, start using ADDR, we would sit in a room, either virtually or physically, and start to write job stories. Now, if your API that you're working on, whether it's an existing one that you want to improve the documentation for, or if it's a new one that you're greenfielding, and it's something that's going to be familiar to the Gen AI, it's probably something that was used in modeling and training early on. You can actually use Gen AI and engage in a session to explore the domain area. So one example that I did was build out a movie database API. And as you can imagine, that's something Gen AI is pretty comfortable with. So I actually asked it to help me build some job stories, and then I refined them and made it a little bit better as I went. But if this is something that's going to be specific to a product that Gen AI is not familiar with, or an enterprise process or something that it may not have all the information for, you may need to still sit down and write your job stories yourselves. You can put them into the chat session and then have it ask you questions to clarify. Have it look for gaps in your job stories. And one of the things that I like to do is see if there's a unifying job story. Oftentimes what we'll do is we'll start focusing on key milestones or key steps along a bigger process. And we'll have job stories for each of those, but we may not have a unifying job story that kind of creates a full picture of how is this, how all these job stories connected, and ultimately what is the goal of the person involved. Once we have that, then we need to break down our job stories into activity steps. And again, Gen AI can come to the rescue here if it's something that's familiar. If it's something that's less familiar to the model, then we might need to sit down and provide some information, and then that'll give it a rich context environment for which you can have it ask you questions and improve things, recommend new job stories, and so on. So we can do that, creating our unified job stories, finding our activity steps, and then what I like to do is just create a markdown table with all the job stories that it's found. So maybe there's a unifying job story at the top, have it produce a markdown table or something familiar, comfortable, that we can drop into a wiki, drop into a Git repo, and whatever it is, however you'd like to collaborate and share that. And then once we have that, then we have something that looks a little like this. Here's something that I did that's a little bit more expanded, so you can see everything in one visual. But for this movie database, what I wanted to do is make sure that I could discover movies that match my interests, evaluate whether a movie is worth watching by maybe looking at all the details about the movie, including reviews, manage my watch list. So maybe something looks interesting, I'm going to add it to my watch list. And then I decide to sit down and watch one of these movies. Let me see who has it available for streaming. Is it an account that I already have, and it's not going to cost me anything more to watch this movie, or am I going to have to go ahead and spend a few dollars and get something going? And so that's kind of the scope of what I designed here. And again, the model is already aware of how all of this works, so not too difficult here. But you can imagine in an environment where you're working with a new product, you're doing product exploration, being able to interact with this model and have it ask you questions and clarify things and work these details out and find gaps in your assumptions is absolutely huge. And the key goal here in the align phase is to come out of it with a framework of understanding what it is that you're trying to achieve. I oftentimes encourage people to use these job stories as the beginnings of acceptance tests when you're building automated test suites. If you have a when clause that says, here's a situation or a problem I want to, that's the job to be done, and that includes the activity steps that were required to get it done. So I can, as the desired outcome, you effectively have precondition, work to be done, and postcondition, and you have an outline of what you need to do. But beyond that, it's going to give a rich context environment to your documentation efforts. And I'll show you what that looks like as we go. So the next phase is define. Define is where we start taking those details from Align. We now understand what it is we need. We've socialized those details. We've made sure that we have assumptions broken down so that we don't write a bunch of throwaway code, that has to be abandoned because we made the wrong assumptions about things. We didn't just completely miss the mark on our API design, our documentation, and everything else that we're working on, the next step is to start defining what the API is going to do. And that means, first of all, looking at what ecosystem boundaries is going to be involved with. Is it going to have to comply with any particular standards for interoperability or for data portability? Are there regulatory requirements it's going to have to abide by? And you can work with that model and define what those are, which will help shape the design in the next phase. The other thing you want to do is start turning those job stories and activity steps into an API profile with all the different operational details, the resources that it's going to be interacting with, and some basic description details. So I've used prompts like generate an API profile, the summarizes the API, and a short description. I might ask it to do it in a tabular format. That's how I generally do it when I teach the process without AI, is we'll use a spreadsheet, we'll have some predefined columns, and we'll just fill those things in. So we'll take a lot of the details that came from the align phase and we'll start bringing those over and figuring out, okay, what's the API need to do? Now, we're not talking about gets and posts and 200s and 204s and 404s and everything else yet. We're just talking about what does the API fundamentally need to do in an abstract way that we need to make happen. And then once we have that, we can have a summary table of our resources, maybe some example fields. Again, if it's something the model's aware of, it can start fleshing that out for you a little bit. It doesn't have to be 100% figured out yet, but it'll give you an idea what are the operations and what resources are we going to interact with as an API. And then I might ask it, well, what else is missing in the profile that I might want to consider now, or that I might want to put on my to-do list, or I might want to factor into my design, factor into my documentation efforts, what might be coming up. So that's the define phase. And so out of it, what we do is we use that context-rich environment we created from the align phase that tells us what we're trying to do, what our outcomes are, kind of gives us a boundary of scope and set of responsibilities for this API. And then we figure out what the resources are, what some basic key fields are for it, a beginning description. Of course, we can expand that out as we go. And then a list of operations that we're going to have. And again, nothing detailed about HTTP yet. This process can work for REST, can work for GraphQL, for gRPC, whatever you want. So we're going to keep it independent of the design style at this point. But what it does do is it gives us some beginnings of our documentation. And Gen AI and the models helping us to generate some things. We can go back and ask it to expand those. And these becomes even more context rich that allows us to move forward into the design phase. And this is going to have a huge impact on our design and documentation. So in the design phase, this is where we take that API profile and we do have to make a design decision about what style we're going to use, REST, GraphQL, gRPC, something else. So we're going to make that decision. We're going to start aligning all of our details from our profile into the patterns and practices that we have. And that's where we want to comply with our style guide that we have set up for our API design style guide and so on and so forth. So in this case, what I might do is say, you're an expert API designer following our REST API guidelines. Here are the style guide rules for compliance. And what I did is I took a style guide and actually put it into, in this case, it was ChatGPT, and had it generate a prompt for me that I could then use to apply the right styling. That ensures that the model is actually going to generate an API that is compliant, or at least mostly compliant, with my style guide. I don't have to go back and rework it. Ideally, I shouldn't even have to use a linter because you should not mess that up, but we know that not everything's 100% perfect. So we accept that we'll probably have some linting tools and other things in the process, but this is going to get us pretty far. So we're going to take the style guide, we're going to turn it into a prompt, we're going to feed that in. So now we have the align phase artifacts of what we're trying to do, the define of what the API needs to look like, our style guide rules that we need to have that it helped us generate in a prompt that was robust and understandable to the model. And then using all of those details, I can say generate an open API 3.x specification. And I can have it generate a first pass, and inevitably on the first pass, it's not going to get everything right. The descriptions are going to be very weak. The documentation is going to be very weak. It's going to lack a lot of things that we want, but that gets us started. It lets us look at the API and say, how are things shaping up? Did I miss something? Once I have that, I might go back and tell it, I need you to expand the documentation. This is ridiculous. A get to /projects or to /movies, it shouldn't just say returns a list of movies. That's not useful at all from a documentation perspective, and it doesn't respect the reader. So what we might want to do is go back and add some additional details. We might also want some open API examples. So rather than reading strings and booleans and numbers, let's put in some example data. And with a movie database API like this, We have plenty of synthetic data to choose from. And synthetic data is very easy to generate for Gen AI. The beautiful thing is we can actually use real world data even, and we don't have to sit down and make, really synthesize really fake data unless we need that, but rather we can use real world data. So from this case, we were able to pull movies and actors and things like that and expand that out. And then I might use something like a mermaid sequence diagram and ask it to build a README or a mermaid diagram or something else as we go. And I might use that during this design phase, but I definitely do it during the refine phase. So if I have it generate an open API specification, it's going to have all the defaults. It's going to look like something that got kicked out of a code first tool, probably. It's going to have a bunch of defaults. It's not going to be really robust. After I gave it prompt number 2 and said, I need you to fix this documentation, I want you to put in some examples, we had something much better come out of it. Not perfect, but it's better. And we could keep improving this as we go. The important thing is now we're seeing our data and our API take shape with real world data or some sort of synthesized data that is understandable to the reader. And from that, it allows you to actually visualize what the API is going to do without having to do a lot of work. So within just a few minutes, we've gone from spending most of our time in the align phase, trying to understand the problem space and everything else, to crafting up an API profile, to designing something, to improving it. So now we can kind of see from a reference documentation perspective, how are things looking? So the last step, the refine phase. This is where we're really going to see how the API is going to perform, and it's going to give us feedback very quickly. It's also going to expedite our documentation efforts. So if you have a brownfield API, an existing API that you want to improve, you could bring it in, give it some of the align artifacts so that it has context-rich environment to run and have it improve your documentation and catch errors for you or catch situations that you may not have thought about before. In a greenfield situation, this is going to accelerate front and back end team integrations and so on. So I'll use prompts like using the job stories and the jobs to be done and the API design we've created so far, create a README document that demonstrates how to use the API to complete each job story. That takes a long time to do, especially if you're trying to generate raw HTTP request and response pairs or anything else. If you want examples from an SDK that might already exist or that you anticipate using and you want it to kind of show what it might look like from an SDK perspective, you could do that. If you want curl examples, you can do that. I keep it to raw HTTP just because I think everybody, technical and non-technical alike, can understand enough about it and not have to worry about programming language hangups. But it's up to you and who your audience is. You can also have it compose a Postman collection, which is really powerful. It'll generate all of the markup necessary to create a Postman collection. You can import it into Postman or any other kind of tool that does something similar. I've noticed that some of the models are not familiar with the Razo so far, which is an emerging specification that just went 1.0 not long ago for tracking workflows and capturing workflows, kind of along the lines of Postman collections and being able to take data from a response on one request and feed it into the request of the next one and be able to chain operations together, but I'm sure it'll get there. And then I've used mermaid sequence diagrams and things to visualize stuff. So in the end, what we get is we get an API design all the way through with a README like this. Now I put it in 3 columns just so it's easier to see for you. But this is the discover movies that match my interest, and it shows you how to browse by genre, browse by actor, browse by director, how that would look. It has some different kinds of data in there. Of course, it could use probably better data, so I'd probably go back and make some improvements to that over time, but you get the idea. So now we have this documentation that we can socialize with people and get feedback, and we can do that really quickly and easily. And then we can generate Postman collections and everything else. So just to kind of wind down the thoughts here. First off, turning business requirements into rich context for Gen AI is going to be critical, and the align phase is really good to help people do that. And as technical writers, as technical leaders, as subject matter experts in your area, you're going to have a huge advantage to be able to do that. And it's also great at synthetic data generation or using real world data to help people understand your API examples quickly and easily. So definitely take advantage of that. And then make sure that your boundaries between your requirements and the Gen AI produced requirements are captured. So if you're blending what you know is real world and what the Gen AI thinks you want, you might need to separate that in some way. So expanding your prompt a little bit or labeling things or keeping things separate in the environment while you work that out is going to be critical. The cost of experimentation is low with Gen AI, so experiment with different design choices. You could actually come up with 3 or 4 different design options and see which one works best. That was something that was very expensive to do previously, and it's much cheaper to do now. But all in all, just take this away. AI is the tool and it's not the artisan. You are the artisan, you're the subject matter expert. So use this to help drive that, get those artifacts in front of people, and get the feedback you want so that you can really turn your API into something special and make sure that the documentation reflects that as well. That's it. Thanks so much.